Hi, guys. This is Mrs. Homer, and today we're going to talk about the history of cell theory and the two main types of cell. So, you should have already watched a video on the history of cell theory. If you haven't, you're going to. But the history of cell theory is kind of intriguing and is filled with lots of kind of strange men. But we'll start with Anton von Leeuwenhoek. He, at the time where everybody else was using these microscopes, that they had kind of figured out and built. He built his own microscopes. And these microscopes really had better resolution and better seeing power than the ones that were being mass marketed at the time. And so he was able to kind of look at a lot of things and see them more clearly. So he saw a couple of things. First of all, he actually looked at his dental scrapings that were on his teeth and saw bacteria. So really, he kind of started microbiology. But he also looked at pond water and he saw single cell organisms in the pond water. And he referred to those as animalcules. So kind of started um, the naming process. So he was followed kind of at the same time, really, they were in communication with each other by Robert Hooke. So, Robert Hooke, yet another scientist, he was looking through his microscope and he was looking at a piece of cork. So, he's like, took a thin slice of cork. And when he saw the little circles that are really cells, it reminded him of like, let's say, a dorm room, but really, it reminded him of the cells that monks live in. And so um, they were just so repeated and they just looked like all the little cells that monks live in that he coined the term or the phrase cells. So while these guys are studying, the cell theory is really developing, and the cell theory is really important to the understanding of cells. So, part one of cell theory is that all cells have to come from other cells, they don't just appear. Which at the time, a lot of scientists did believe that cells would just appear out of nowhere. But we know now for sure that all cells come from other cells. So if I have one cell, if he's gonna become 2 cells, he will go through that process of cell division, and then we will have 2 cells, as all cells come from other cells. So that's the first part of cell theory. The man who really, kind of made this widespread and understood is Rudolf Virchow. He determined that all cells must come from other cells, which is now a main part of the cell theory. Now, part two of the cell theory is that all living things are made of cells. So if it's alive, it has to be made of cells. It can be made of just one cell or it can be made of lots of cells, be multicellular. But if it's alive, it's made of cells. So bacteria, even, are made of cells. Animals are made of cells. And the one scientist who told us this or who kind of discovered this was the scientist Theodore Schwann. He studied animals and looked at several animals under slides. And it just eventually hit him that was like, oh, geez, every time I look at an animal, it's made of cells. And to remember that Schwann was the one who told us that animals are made of cells, we just think of Schwann like a swan. So animals are made of cells, and then obviously plants are made of cells. And who came up with that idea? That was Matthias Schleiden. So he did the same thing. He was looking at all plants, and eventually he realized that, gosh, all plants are made of cells too. And so we remember this by saying we're sliding on a banana peel. So he was the one who talked about all plants being made of cells. And so together, with the contribution of other scientists, we've concluded that all cells, all living things are made of cells. Whether you're plant, animal, or bacteria, you're made of cells. And then the last part of cell theory is very basic. It's just that a cell is the basic structure is the basic unit of structure and function in living things, which basically means you can get as small as a cell, and that will have all what it takes to function as a living thing. But if you get smaller than a single cell, it can no longer be considered a living thing because it doesn't have everything that it needs to do all the functions of life. So the cell is the smallest unit of structure and function, and it is the smallest living thing. So again, the cell theory, all cells come from other cells. All living things are made of cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. So these three things comprise the cell theory. Now, the second thing that we're going to look at is looking at what cells are made of. And we'll really get into um, the organelles of cells and review what you learned in middle school a little later. But for right now, we're going to focus on what all cells have. So, all cells have four basic parts. They have the cell membrane, what we call the cytosol or the cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes. So, let's look and remind you of what these four things are. So the cell membrane is the outer covering of cells. All cells have a cell membrane. Doesn't matter if you're a plant cell, a fungus cell, a bacteria, if you're one cell or you're made of hundreds of cells, your cells have a cell membrane. And the function of the cell membrane is to control what comes in and out of a cell. So it basically maintains what we call homeostasis, which is the balance needed to stay alive. So it maintains those conditions inside the cell so that the cell doesn't die. And we're going to take a closer look at the cell membrane once we're done learning about the basics of cells. So you can see here in this picture that it's kind of complex. It has two layers, it has all sorts of stuff poking in and out of it. And so we'll talk about how the cell membrane is structured so that it can do its job of letting things in and out of the cell. So that's the first thing all cells have. The next thing all cells have are DNA. So they have DNA in some way. Some for us, it's our chromosomes, which is the general for plants and animals. In bacteria, you might see slightly different bacterial loops of DNA, plasmids, or other loops of DNA, but it's all still that same basic genetic code. So all cells have to contain DNA. And that DNA, remember, is the recipe book to make proteins, and it controls all the cell processes. And so that's an important, definitely an important part of being alive and being a cell. Number three, all cells are going to have cytosol or what we call cytoplasm. So these two words get really confusing. But the cytosol really is just the liquid that fills the cell. So it's where all these chemical reactions are going to take place. It's where all the organelles or the DNA is floating. The cytoplasm is defined a little bit differently. The cytoplasm looks at the nucleus and it says everything outside the nucleus is called the cytoplasm. So it's more like an area, but a lot of times you'll hear the liquid called cytoplasm instead of cytosol, and that's okay for our purposes this year. And then lastly, all cells contain ribosomes. So ribosomes are those little dots that we see on the endoplasmic reticulum. They can be free floating in the cell, but they are the site of protein synthesis. So we looked at protein synthesis at the beginning of the year, where the DNA got transcribed and translated and turned into or kind of read into a protein. And the ribosome is what reads the mRNA and assembles the protein. And so we say that the ribosome is the site of protein synthesis or the site of protein production. It's what produces protein. And again, they're either floating in the cytosol or they can be attached to the endoplasmic reticulum if a cell has that. All right. So the next part of this is to take our understanding. So we know all cells have those four basic types, four basic parts, but there are two basic types of cells, and we want to look at how these two basic cells are different from one another. So the two basic types of cells are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So, we're going to learn how to compare and contrast the characteristics of both of these, as well as looking at some of the basic organelles that they contain. So the two main categories of cells, again, are eukaryotic and prokaryotic. So when I say eukaryotic, I always think "eu" means do. They do have a lot of things. For instance, they do have a nucleus where the DNA is. So if you have a eukaryotic cell, you should be able to find its nucleus and you should be able to see the DNA contained within it. And so eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. The other type of cell is a prokaryotic cell. I always say pro means no. So consequently, they say no to the nucleus. And instead of having their DNA contained in that DNA is floating freely in the cytoplasm. So it doesn't really have that extra layer of protection. So U means do, they do have a nucleus. Pro means no, no nucleus. So that's like one of the biggest ways you can tell the difference between the two main categories of cells, the eukaryotic and the prokaryotic cells. The next thing that we can look at with prokaryotic and eukaryotic are the types of cells. So, eukaryotic are plants, animals, fungus, and protists. So, basically, that first major domain contains those plants, animals, fungus, and protists. And they're made up of eukaryotic cells. And even you are made up of them. So, what are prokaryotic cells? What's left? So, prokaryotic cells are bacteria cells only. So, all of the bacteria, of which there are lots and lots of bacteria, those are considered a prokaryotic cell. And really, it makes sense because prokaryotic literally means before the nucleus. And so, this is where the bacteria cells are. All right, some other things that you will need to know about eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So remember, eu means do. They do have more than one cell, or at least they can. So they can be single celled, but they can also be multicellular and oftentimes are. They are also larger and more complex. So eu means do. They do have more than one cell. Pro means no. They say no to more than one cell. So they're primarily going to be single cell organisms. And so they're also very small and simple. So you do have more than one cell. Pro says no to more than one cell. You is large and complex, like you. You're large and complex. Prokaryotics are small, like bacteria, and very simple, even though they can make us very sick. So again, what's inside of both of them? A cell membrane on the outside, the liquid of the cytosol, they have DNA in there, and they have ribosomes. But what else is inside of them? So for eukaryotic cells, they do have what we call membrane-bound organelles, which are going to basically include all of the other organelles that we're going to look at and study in the next part. So eukaryotic cells can contain any of these membrane-bound organelles. Not all eukaryotic cells are going to have all of those organelles, but they do contain membrane-bound organelles. Whereas, so examples would be like this chloroplast, which can be found in a plant cell to make food for the plant, or this mitochondria, which can be found in all types of eukaryotic cell, which produce ATP energy for the cell. The prokaryotic cells say no. So pro means no. They say no to membrane bound organelles. So any organelle that has a membrane or is made of membranes, prokaryotic cells do not have these. Instead, they only have ribosomes, and they need ribosomes because they still need to produce proteins. So they say no to the other organelles, and they only contain ribosomes. So to wrap up, U means do. They have a nucleus. They do have a nucleus. They do have membrane bound organelles. They are large and complex. They have a cell membrane like everything else. They sometimes have a cell wall, not all the time. They're plants, animals, fungus, and protists, and they are often multicellular. So they do have more than one cell. Prokaryotic cells, pro means no. They say no to the nucleus. They say no to membrane bound organelles. They only have those ribosomes, which are not membrane bound. They are small, simple. They do have a cell membrane, okay? So they don't say no to that. And they also will have a cell wall. And that's because they're so small and simple, they need added protection. So all prokaryotic cells will have a cell wall. Eukaryotic can have a cell wall, but oftentimes will not have cell walls. And then prokaryotics, again, only bacteria, and they're unicellular, only having one cell. So they say no to being multicellular. So, how did these cells come to be? So, the idea was that this endosymbiotic theory was that we had two independent bacteria, so two prokaryotic cells, and one basically ate the other one. But what happened is that while it was inside the other one, it did some really good things for it. It helped it out and they benefited from each other. So the one benefited from being inside of the other bacteria. And so eventually, when it started to reproduce, we started to see these cells which had what we consider a nucleus. So we went from not having a nucleus to being engulfed, and now we have a nucleus. So thus, the eukaryotic cell do have a nucleus is born. So in a nutshell, you know, bam, now we have a nucleus. All right, so that's the end. So we looked at cell theory, so the three parts of the cell theory. We looked at some of the scientists that helped develop the cell theory. We looked at the four things that are inside of all cells. And then we looked at the main differences between prokaryotic, meaning no, and eukaryotic, meaning do, cells. We'll continue looking at the different types of cells and what they contain in the next part of our lesson.